Story 1. If they stayed random, it's highly unlikely we would ever catch them. Most murders are emotional, spouses, relatives, etc. It takes a lot to want to kill someone. After eliminating family, you ask, who had a conflict with this person? Once you get past that, things get really hard. Nationwide, the clearance rate for murders in the United States is now less than 50%, so one more random murder is going to lose resources quickly. The serial killers we catch almost always make mistakes that reveal a murder is connected, reusing the same gun, the same method of operation, and then make mistakes that give away their identity. It's a near certainty that there is a smart serial killer in the country who is accumulating victims with almost no chance of being caught because they are staying random. Story 2. One of the most grotesque facts I read was Ted Bundy said that after he had killed his victims, for days he would go and revisit their corpses and even perform sexual acts with their dead bodies until putrefaction of the dead body no longer allowed for him to do this. Story 3. Dennis Rader was my uncle's scout troop leader. He taught them how to use knots he used to bind his victims. He told them he used certain knots all the time. Story 4. That one of Dahmer's victims managed to escape to the street. People saw him, called the police, and the officers let Dahmer take the young man back inside. Story 5. Alright, so Israel Keys was a bank robber as well as a serial killer. In one of the towns where he robbed a bank, a construction worker went missing the day before. He was known to have long black hair. Keys robbed the bank wearing the guy's hard hat and what looked to be a long black wig as a disguise. They asked Keys where he bought the wig. Bought it? There's more than one way to get a wig. He scalped this dude and used his hair as a disguise. Story 6. The single scariest thing I have ever read was Ted Bundy's application letter to law school, in which he does not lie but instead chooses his words very carefully and pointedly by saying, I believe a full and comprehensive knowledge of the law is essential for the life I have chosen for myself. Story 7. Fred West impregnated his younger sister, and that's why he was kicked out of Herefordshire, only to go kill a child with his work van in Scotland. Both crimes should have put him away for a bit before his killing spree. His wife, Rosemary, was a prostitute who had her father as one of her clients. Story 8. There's a sad and unsettling account of an experience that was had by the father of Jane MacDonald, one of the victims of the infamous Yorkshire Ripper. It seems that while Mr. MacDonald was waiting up for his daughter to get home from her campus, he dozed off on the couch. At one point, he later said he sensed Jane quietly enter the living room, kiss him tenderly on his head, and go upstairs. He was later awoken by police knocking on his door to inform him that Jane's body had been found near her university. He was confused and swore blind at the time that there must be some mistake. The poor guy had to go and check her room and the rest of the house to realize she'd never actually made it home after all. Story 9. Paul Bernardo was interviewed by police for his vicious rapes in Scarborough. Based on tips from people who knew him and the fact that a composite sketch looked exactly like an artist's sketch of him, the police decided he was too charming, forthcoming, and nice-looking to be their suspect, but he voluntarily gave a DNA sample. Later, when he and his wife were abducting, raping, and murdering underage girls, he was again questioned by police after several people, including his childhood best friend, tipped the police that he was likely the person they were looking for. Again, he was dismissed as a suspect because a nice-looking young man who was so charming and comfortable around police couldn't possibly be a monster. When the DNA was finally analyzed, they couldn't write him off anymore. Story 10. One of the most disturbing facts is that some serial killers have maintained normal lives and relationships while hiding their crimes, which can be chillingly deceptive. Story 11. The Toy Box Killer, David Parker Ray, built a soundproof trailer he called his Toy Box, where he tortured and killed his victims. He recorded detailed audio tapes describing what he would do to them and played these tapes for his victims before beginning their torture. Story 12. Dean Coral, the Candyman, abducted, tortured, and murdered teenage boys in Houston, Texas. Instead of laughing maniacally and rubbing it in the boys' faces throughout the torture period, he would repeatedly thank the boys he was torturing for letting him do this to them, and how much he loved and treasured them for this. Story 13. Fred and Rosemary West killed for over 2 decades. Many victims were buried or hidden in their house where their kids grew up, and they buried their firstborn daughter under the backyard porch. When they were caught, Fred vowed to take all the blame, but he talked too much to the police and implicated her. After that, Rose turned from him entirely and portrayed herself as a victim. It didn't save her, but a similar defense saved Karla Homolka from being imprisoned with her husband, and she is free now. Story 14. The 14-year-old boy who escaped Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment naked, with a hole drilled in his head, ran to 2 police officers asking for help. Dahmer told the officers that they had a lover's quarrel and the boy was drunk or something, so they left the boy back with Dahmer. He got out, went for help, thought he'd be saved, only for them to give him right back to his captor. Jeffrey Dahmer told a psychologist he drilled a hole in the head of a Laotian boy and poured in acid before police encountered Dahmer and the naked, dazed boy on a sidewalk, the psychologist testified Tuesday. The officers involved said they believed Dahmer when he told them the boy was his adult homosexual lover and left them in Dahmer's apartment. Dahmer has said he killed the boy shortly after police left. Judith Becker, a defense psychologist, is the first witness in Dahmer's insanity trial to indicate that police failed to notice a hole in the boy's head. But defense attorney Gerald Boyle said at a news conference after the testimony that police couldn't have noticed the injury. There was no blood apparent from the boy's head, he said. A defense psychiatrist testified Monday that Dahmer used a drill to perform brain surgery on some of the victims in an effort to turn them into sexually pliant zombies, but strangled them when he realized they might leave. The boy, 14-year-old Konorak Synthesumphone, fled the apartment May 27th when Dahmer went to the store, but officers returned him when Dahmer convinced them the two had a lover's quarrel. The incident prompted critics to accuse police of insensitivity and discrimination toward homosexuals and minorities. 2 officers later were fired. Ms. Becker also testified that Dahmer got a sexual thrill from eating body parts of some of the 17 men and boys he admitted killing and dismembering. Periodically, he would take portions out of the freezer and cook them, Ms. Becker said. While he ate, he would become sexually aroused. Dahmer had sex, in one way or another, with all 17 victims after death, Ms. Becker said. Ms. Becker said Dahmer soaked one victim's genitals and head in acetone to mummify them. "Maybe I was born too late," Ms. Becker quoted Dahmer as saying. "Maybe I was an Aztec." Story 15. Scott Glenn was hired to play Jack Crawford in Silence of the Lambs. In order to do that, he was set up with the Federal Bureau of Investigation's profilers as preparation. Glenn was a hardcore anti-death penalty guy, so one of the profilers sat Glenn down and had him listen to an audio tape. On the tape was the torture and murder of Shirley Ledford. It was recorded as it happened by Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris. She was their 5th victim. Glenn had trouble talking about that preparation during the press tour of the movie, and lately has stated he still gets nightmares all these years later. Once the tape was over and he was able to gather himself, he, from that moment on, became a supporter of the death penalty in cases involving serial murder. Side note, there's an Easter egg in Mindhunter about the tape. Story 16. I have a personal story. The first known victims of the Golden State Killer were friends of my stepfather. They were all attending Sacramento State University at the time, and my stepfather and his then-girlfriend had plans to play some card games with the would-be victims. My stepfather and his girlfriend arrived at their friend's apartment on time for their planned hangout, yet there was no answer at the door. They were perplexed as to why they had left the house when they had invited people over. They waited around for a while to see if maybe their friends were delayed on an errand or something. They kept knocking as well, assuming they had taken a nap or something. After some time, they gave up waiting and went home. As it turns out, their friends were either already dead, or it's possible that the Golden State Killer was still in there with them when my stepfather and his date were knocking and waiting outside. Had they arrived earlier, perhaps it would have deterred the killer, saving their lives. But the timing just didn't work out. Story 17. There is a decent amount of evidence that claims John Wayne Gacy actually had some accomplices. One of the individuals associated with him was linked to a murderous pedophile ring. Story 18. BTK Killer was the leader of his church youth group, well respected in his town, and installed home security systems in his neighborhood to protect people from himself. Story 19. Joe D'Angelo was relatively recently identified as the original Night Stalker, the Golden State Killer, and the Visalia Ransacker. He terrorized California for years. Eventually, part of his modus operandi was to target couples so he could debilitate the husband and rape the wife. He would hogtie the man and stack plates on him. While sexually assaulting the woman, D'Angelo would be attuned to the sound of plates falling or crashing, so he would know if the man was in the process of becoming a potential threat. These attacks often took obscene amounts of time, like hours, because he would take breaks from terrorizing the couple and doing horrible things to raid their refrigerator for snacks. D'Angelo had an unusually high level of patience when scouting potential victims. He was capable of, for example, standing stock still while observing a possible house, looking for patterns of behavior and possible entry points, to the extent of him recognizing opportunities to enter the house and plant items that would be useful for a subsequent attack. He would know when he could enter the house unobstructed and unseen and stash binding materials where he could easily grab them, but the tenants would not necessarily notice them. Story 20. Dean Corll, who murdered at least 28 boys in Houston, was involved in some way with a man who ran a pedophile ring with tens of thousands of customers, John David Norman. John David Norman was also potentially connected to John Wayne Gacy. John David Norman ran multiple child pornography rings for decades. Activities included selling boys into sex slavery. Most of the serious evidence against him disappeared when it was sent to the State Department. Story 21. When you look into serial killers, you will find most of them had many people who thought they were doing something wrong. Coworkers, neighbors, or random strangers, there is usually a list of people who had some sort of feeling that something was off about them, and it is not uncommon that the police investigated them a few times before they are finally caught. Story 22. More like general theories than facts about serial killers that I have come across. There is a surge of serial killers in a generation that is born or raised during a war, possibly because conscripted fathers with untreated post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, come back from deployment and create a stressful, neglectful, or abusive home environment. Or they are raised by single mothers who are stressed, neglectful, or abusive and develop a pathological hatred for women. The Vietnam War is often used as an example to support this theory. We are no longer in the golden age of traditional serial killers because most of them become school shooters or domestic terrorists instead. Alternatively, the golden age of serial killers never ended, but resources that had previously been used to study, identify, and catch serial killers have been diverted to preventing foreign and domestic terrorism, and there has never been a better time to be a serial killer. There are fewer serial killers because advancements in forensic science and forensic psychology mean we have gotten better at catching them after their first kill, which is slightly more positive. Alternatively, we may have gotten worse at catching them because the prevalence of true crime media teaches serial killers how to cover their tracks and diversify their kills to make serial homicides harder to link together. The accessibility of national and international travel allows serial killers to spread their kills over different jurisdictions or countries. Modern serial killers are traveling to countries with high crime rates to partake in homicide tourism, and then returning home to live normal lives. Story 23. Luis Garavito is suspected of having over 300 victims, but only 180 or 190 have been confirmed. He murdered mostly children in Venezuela and Colombia. I lived as a child in South America for a few years, and my parents drilled into our heads that we were never to go outside alone. It wasn't the safest place to begin with, and this is how they scared us. He received over 1,800 years in prison, but it eventually got reduced to 25 years or something like that. Story 24. I have read somewhere that Edmund Kemper used his mother's severed head to give himself oral sex, inserting his genitals through the neck and out the mouth. Story 25. Aileen Wuornos was sexually abused by her grandfather, and she lived in a tent for some time as a child in Michigan to avoid him. Just in case you were wondering where she got her hatred for men. Story 26. Apart from the terrible things serial killers do and have done, I once heard a serial killer say something that's particularly creepy to me somehow and sticks with me. He said, "The first time you kill someone, you feel you are crossing a line, but after your first kill, that feeling is gone with the next kill." It makes it sound like it's pretty easy to descend into madness. Story 27. Gilles de Rais was a French knight and lord who notably fought alongside Joan of Arc during the Hundred Years' War. He was appointed as Marshal of France and was a hero for lifting the sieges at Lagny and Orleans. However, he was found to have lured around 40 young peasant boys to his castle, where he raped and murdered them, allegedly using their bodies in satanic rituals. He was executed by being garroted to death and burned at the stake. He is the inspiration for the story of Bluebeard.